don't feel like buying anything because I have to think about where I'm going to put it. So from a financial perspective, it's enabling me to live a different lifestyle, I think, which is great. I think most people in tiny houses would agree that, you know, you don't have to think of it as being forever. So it may be a rung on the ladder, a sort of tool that helps you if you want to live in a normal size house to do that as well. So don't think of it as, you know, going to a tiny house. It's something that you would have to do forever. It could be for a period of time, and you know, it's something that I still don't know what I will end up doing, but the position I'm in it's not just about the house for me now. My house is just where I lay my head, as it were. For me, living in the eco village is a much bigger part of the picture with the community here. You know, the being able to grow food and you know, live in a slightly different way. So for me, it's not just the tiny house anymore. It's about where I live and the community I live in.
You're muted, Kim.
Sorry about that. Elle, I'd like you to answer this question as well, because I've got different questions that have come in for Janine and Chloe and Glade. So I'll get you other two sets of panelists to answer that in a second.
Sure. So yeah, how I view my future, I definitely look at what I was doing around my consumption, around my footprint. I view those things as completely differently, regardless of whether I stay in a tiny home or I move to a larger home at a later date. That those practices, the practices that I've learned in a tiny space, will go with me from here on in. And yeah, it does change the way you think about your finances, your resources. It doesn't come with the most stable of foundations. While we have all of the movement going on, all of the stuff that Atha is working on and that Janine's working on, when I'm interested to see how all of those things come together. And I think for people who are living in tiny homes, there, unless you're in a community that's set up and is solid and you know you're going to be able to stay there long term, you have to be very comfortable with uncertainty. And the way I view my future is very much going with the flow and adapting as I need. This project is locked in for a 2-year period, but after that, I know I'm going to need to be very flexible if I want to continue pursuing tiny house living and promoting the industry.
Thank you for that. Now, I'd just like to, sorry, that's a bit funny. I'd just like to ask Janine this question. Is the issue, and I know you partially answered this, but if you could specifically address Evelyn's question, is the issue around tiny houses and building permits only relevant to secondary buildings, or are there issues in getting one approved as a main building on a parcel of land?
Thanks, Evelyn. As we've highlighted, you know, there is no consistent decision around Australia, and throughout what we're trying to focus on is 3 avenues. One is the building, or in New South Wales it's called DA. That's what, you know, DA stands for development application. In other areas it's called planning application. So that's that avenue. Then there's the local laws, and this is something that Glade covered earlier, where it's deemed as, currently tiny houses are deemed as a caravan. And in many councils, it's covered under their local laws. Some councils will allow people to live in a caravan for 30, 60, or even up to 180 days, but not for permanent living. There is that example though. However, there is that change in, you know, an out of the box issue up in Brisbane where you can live in the tiny house, but that's what they're allowing in that municipality. And then the other pathway is about seen to be constructing it safely. And you know, what I've been advocating for a couple of years now in this space is about we're wanting people to live safely in a structurally sound and thermally comfortable tiny house, because we want people to live in them permanently. And so therefore, you know, my focus area for me, and also through the ATHRI, is about, you know, identifying the building side of things, how they can be built safely. So it really does depend on which council area at this point in time, But that's what we're trying to do through ATHRI, is trying to get a uniform approach where we can start trialing a number of things out there nationally, so then people can take that to their council and seek permanent dwelling. At the moment, you know, they are, you know, we're spanning between a caravan. We're deemed as tiny houses on wheels. This is deemed as a caravan. Somebody, and I'll just answer this. So we're really talking about tiny houses on wheels. If you've got footings and foundations, then that goes into a different category. And somebody asked if it would be deemed as a bungalow type of situation, and yes, that would be. And that again depends on your council area. And just to take Kim's point in regards to a person who's a relative of or dependent, I think you said in New South Wales it's a person who's relative of or part of the family. In Victoria, that's not the case. They have to be our secondary dwelling. They have to be a family member who is fully dependent upon the person in the primary dwelling. So that's why in Victoria, our change in the planning requirements is so crucial, and it's a real game changer for us in Victoria, because we've been lagging behind in that area. Thank you.
Thank you. And it's also the same for Brisbane. I know I said Brisbane, you can put a tiny house on a block of land. Brisbane, you can also have a tiny house with a house. The problem is you can't pay rent to the big house, and it has to be it has to be a family member. And again, that's going to help some people, but it's certainly not going to help an awful lot of people who need to be able to rent a tiny house, or who have been able to build or buy a tiny house and want to be able to put it somewhere. So now I'm going to ask the question to, this is to Chloe and Glade, and it's from Labosh Hanuska. Can I ask Chloe and Glade, how did you manage to live in a tiny house for many years without council evicting you? Do you have a permanent house on your land as well?
We don't live in a tiny house permanently. We built it on our property, which is officially ours. Weekender.
Sorry, you dropped out there for a second. Can you just repeat the last sentence that you said? You just dropped out for a second.
So our tiny house on wheels that we've built on our property is a weekender, and it's not used permanently.
Okay, and thank you very much for that. And just bearing in mind, I probably should be a little careful with some of these questions, because, you know, at the moment, tiny house dwelling is a little bit tricky. So I know I haven't necessarily mentioned my town name, and you know, we are all trying to navigate the things that we're doing with our tiny houses, and trying to push the boundaries, and not necessarily saying that you two are, Glade and Chloe, but we're just trying to move this forward, because there are so many people who so desperately need to live in tiny houses. So I'm going to ask a question now. I'm going to ask a couple of fun questions here. So first of all, and I'll start with Elle. Elle, what is your favorite thing about living in a tiny house, and the thing that bugs you the most about living tiny? That was to you, Elle.
Sure. So what I love about it most is, knowing everything I own, and having my environment is something either of value or something that I love, and that I'm not wasting resources. That, and tapping into I'm so much more tapped into the nature and the outdoor space, and it brings that part of myself alive. So even if it's just sitting on the couch and looking out and watching all the little weird creatures run around my yard, that's a really lovely part of living in a tiny house. It forces you to think differently about the environment that you're in, both in your possessions and what's going on outside the space. The thing that bugs me the most was originally setting up the composting toilet. Warning to everyone, these systems do take a little bit of time to balance out in the beginning, and yeah, I didn't really like that balancing out period while all the microbes and enzymes were getting to the right level. It was only like a day and a half, but that really bugged me.
Great, thank you. And Chris, can you tell us your favorite and most buggy point about tiny living?
My favorite, similar to Elle, actually, I mean, I'm very, very lucky where I live, the location of where I live. So I love my veggie patch. I love living in the eco village. I think that's one of the favorite things that living tiny brought me here. The thing that bugs me the most, and this is going to sound bad, but I really hate it when people ask me what I hate about my tiny house, because that's always the first question they ask. They don't generally ask what's the thing I really love about my tiny house. They always assume that there's something I hate, and that's what they always ask about. No offense, Kim.
None taken, none taken. Now I have a question from the panelists, not panelists, a question from people who are attending. And I'd like to address this a little bit, and then I've got a question for Janine, and I'll go back to Chloe and Glade in a second. And actually, Chloe and Glade, you might also be able to answer this. So the question was from Caitlin Sockwell, and it's, can someone speak on funding of the tiny, the costs, loan from banks, mortgages versus personal loan, or saving up to purchase outright, purchase own land versus renting land from someone? So at ATHA, I've been talking to a man about working with mortgage brokers. At the moment, there are very few banks that will actually lend money to buy a tiny house. And the people that I was dealing with the most when I was building tiny houses were older single women. And older single women have a smaller superannuation, and because they're older, they may not have secure work, especially now post-COVID. So at the moment, the way it stands, and what I've seen people normally doing at the moment, is that they're getting a personal loan. And the difficulty with that is because it's still a caravan, it's still, I think it's like an entertainment loan or something like that. So it's very difficult to be able to get as much as you need for the tiny house. But we are working on that with some mortgage broker to try to see if we can't get some banks to make some very good loans. There are some companies, some tiny house builders that will help you to finance as well. And there are regarding the land, there are some different people around Australia who are trying to work together to get cooperative land buying together so that they can put tiny house villages sort of together. Glade and Chloe, have you had anything to do with financing?
We've had the question a lot, and to be totally honest, we're probably not the right people to ask about it. We don't know enough about what's available, so maybe Chris might be better to address that too.
Thank you, Chris, and then Janine, because I think Janine, you knew of a mortgage broker who was doing something. Chris?
I can't really talk to necessarily the actual financial services bit around it, but my situation is because I am sharing a piece of land, so I probably wouldn't have been able to afford to buy the lot and build the house that is required for me to live in my tiny house. So where I live in the eco village, Jazz, my co-owner, has built a house, and so therefore I can live in my tiny house permanently because we co-share the land. So it's more around the collaborative living aspect of it and I was lucky. I could then, you know, my portion I didn't need to finance. But yeah, it's the thinking outside of the box in terms of how is it possible to live in a tiny house on wheels when you have a requirement for land and a requirement for another house. So by the time you get to the end of that, what's the point necessarily in going down the tiny house path? But it's looking at where you can get those synergies for somebody who perhaps can't afford to buy a land and a house, but could do it board in combination with someone else. In my situation, it's working very well for both of us.
Thanks. And Janine?
Yeah, so generally speaking, and obviously all of the content that we're talking about is more general, because apart from the people who are actually living and, you know, living and experiencing the tiny houses as well, unless you actually own the land, which is actually has a title, you will not be able to get a mortgage. The discussion that, or the projects that Kim raised about, you know, land share and, you know, that is certainly something that a lot of people are looking at, and they might be able to get, you know, mortgages for the land. But when we're talking about the majority of people who are wanting to live tiny because they haven't got enough money to buy the land in the first place, they will not be able to get an actual mortgage for the tiny house because it doesn't come with a land title. So what they need to be looking at, it's a different terminology, and Kim said one point, but another sort of finance is called asset finance. It's basically like a personal loan. It's like, you know, getting a loan for your car or a caravan or another, you know, tool or another, you know, device. So if you think about it, from a mortgage perspective, it is much better, or from a loan perspective, it takes a long time to actually know what to ask and the right questions of various different banks to see whether, you know, they would even entertain an asset finance side of things. So quite honestly, probably the best thing you could possibly do is actually work with a broker. And you don't pay the broker directly. Whenever they find the right loan for you, they get paid by the bank. And it might not be a bank, but it may be a bank. And I've already been in discussion with Bank Australia because they're my bank, and I know they've been a supporter of, you know, the Sustainable House Day over the years. You know, they're starting to know that tiny houses are need to be part of the housing equation. So they are starting to have a look at how they could contribute or participate in offering loans. And as I said, it will not be a mortgage unless you actually own the land.
Thanks, Janine. Another thing that I've been saying an awful lot, and I think anybody who's listening to this, when you go and talk to any councils or when you're talking about tiny houses, I think one of the things that's going to move us into the realm where we can legalize tiny houses, and this is what's happening in the States, is that I had Zach Giffen from Tiny House Nation stay at my house after he was at the Tiny House Carnival. And he said that what he's done in the States is he's pushing it out there, and this was pre-COVID, like, I mean, days pre-COVID, but it was pre-COVID, but pushing out there that the tiny houses are not only an answer to affordable housing for people who need affordable housing, they're also an income stream for Middle Australia. So, you know, he was saying Middle America is in financial strife, and this is a way that Middle America can actually start paying attention to tiny houses. And I think we really need to be talking that up, especially right now. If you know, the middle class in Australia gets behind tiny houses and says, not only, oh yeah, they're cute, but I'm never going to need one of them. They actually do need one of them. They need one of them in their backyard that creates an income stream. I mean, you compare the cost of putting in a granny flat in your own backyard that's anywhere from $140,000 to $240,000. To put that in your own backyard to get an income stream out of that, it's going to take a long time to pay off that mortgage before you get the income stream. If you open up your backyard or your acres of land to somebody who already has their granny flat or already has their tiny house and they put it on your block, all you have to pay for is the infrastructure. And the infrastructure could be anywhere from nothing if they're completely off grid and your council allows that, to I put a tiny house on a farm block that was 100 meters away from the source of the water and the electricity, and that cost $5,000. But that's 100 meters. That was a very long trench. So for the homeowner, I mean, we really need to be pushing this, that this is good, not just for tiny house dwellers. It's also good for Middle Australia, especially right now. Okay, so now we had another question in here. Excuse me. Janine already answered what a DA is. Could you talk about heating, cooling, thermal construction, please? Now, who would like to answer that one? I'll open that one up. Janine?
Sorry, thank you for that. The reason why I put my hand up is I teach in sustainable building design. So what's really important to understand, first and foremost, the tiny houses are a really small space. They can be heated up really, really quickly. So you should be thinking about, and even in cooler climates, like I'm down in Melbourne, you know, down in Tassie, quite a few people here are also from Tassie as well. Obviously you've got cooler climates again. Chloe and Glade, you're up in the hills, you know, you're in a cooler climate as well. But we can heat our tiny houses, you know, really quite efficiently with just a small heating system. A lot of people are choosing, you know, little mini wood heaters. Others are choosing, like myself, an infrared heater system. Chris, you probably don't have much heating up there. Oh, you had a little gas heater up there. But the key thing is that because tiny houses can heat up really quickly, and because we're moving to a heating, you know, we're all moving through climate change, we want to make sure that we're trying to position our tiny houses to have some good summer shading. Now, you can put, if you're also going to be off grid, try to put your panels in the sun, but park your tiny house in the shade. I'm not saying it has to, we don't want it to be dark. We want to allow sufficient light to come through, but we really can, you know, heat our home very, very easily. So thinking about that concept, but also from an insulation perspective, really, really good insulation in your subfloor, your walls and your roof, because most people won't have a ceiling. They'll just have the roof structure, and put in circular fans, recirculating fans, so reverse cycle ceiling fans to help create that air movement. It will just make you feel it a bit cooler. It won't cool the air, it will make you feel a bit cooler. And also positioning your windows, cross-flow ventilation, and your doors to allow that cross-flow to occur. Position your house so that you can actually bring in that cooling breeze, so to help it cool more naturally.
Yep, go ahead, Chloe and Glade.
One very small point with regard to the solar panels as well. If you basically cover your roof with solar panels and there's a 100 mm gap between the roof and the panels, there's your roof is in the shade all year round as well, so there's that buffer.
That's a really good point. I never thought of that. Now, I just had, first of all, I haven't been looking much at the chat. I've been going straight to the Q&A for the questions, but I just noticed that Chris has put in here the TED Talk that Zach did. I love that TED Talk. Zach didn't love that TED Talk. He said there was lots that he wanted to change, but that was, you know, after he had done the TED Talk. He's an amazing advocate for pushing tiny houses forward. And they're lovely people. Now, someone also said, I wonder if we could start a not-for-profit online directory for sustainability contacts, including people with land to share, looking for land to share, buy and sell, trade, and so on, like Facebook. Now, just on that note, Mel in Brisbane and somebody else might need to help me out here. I always forget the name of her page. She's got a page that puts landowners, people with land, together with people who have tiny houses who are looking for land. Does anyone know the name of her page? Her name is Mel Sparkles, and it's on Facebook, and it's a page about land for tiny houses. So does anyone remember that name?
Land to buy and sell for tiny homes in Australia. I'll find the link and I'll post it to the chat.
Thanks for that. Thanks very much, Jess. And yep.
We've
Janine?
also got, there's also 2 others that are currently in existence at the moment, Tiny House Real Estate and also Tiny House listings as well. So there are, what it would be great to see, and I think there's somebody, mentioned this about, Sue mentioned this, is actually having it state by state. Like Mel's one's fantastic, but a lot of it is Southeast Queensland based and Sunshine Coast. So, and also there's Fred's Tiny House community as well. So, there is quite a bit out there, but it's all bits and pieces to my understanding.
The other thing is on ATHA, every Sunday on our Facebook page, it's a buy and sell place. So you can put things up on that to buy and sell things. Okay, and I'm going to ask another question. And Elle, we haven't heard from you in a little bit. So Elle, how would you suggest that people find somewhere to situate their tiny homes?
Well, there is a group where Fred's Tiny Houses has a council kind of database where people have approached councils and they've mapped and recorded the responses from their local council. If you have an area in mind, I would go and check that space first to see whether they're getting a positive or negative response. If you can speak to the people who have already approached council in that area, have a chat with them about what the council's objections were. Think outside of the box. How can you negate those concerns? Canvass your local area, and even when you do find.
I think we've just lost Elle for a little bit. We might have to come back to even if you do find. And also Grant from Eco Design Tiny Houses is he's now suggesting, the last time I spoke to him, he was saying, tell people to go to councils and actually ask the councils, because he was saying that some councils were very open to a building permit or a what we call a DA. Elle is back. Elle, what were you going to say to finish that? We lost you just before people should find, I think you said. No, it's not a great connection. Okay, hang on a second. We'll just, sorry, Elle, you're frozen there. Okay, yes.
I was just thinking maybe Elle could have more success if she turned the video off.
Okay, well, Elle, we'll wait until you give that a try and then maybe hear what else you had to say. Oh, here, nope, we've lost Elle again, so that's all right. And Chris, can you tell me, how has your life improved through living tiny?
Oh, that's a very long story, and a bottle of wine would be required for that, I'm afraid. Financial, the ability to be flexible. I would say, to live my life in a slightly different way. I have family in Europe, as you know, and I've been very lucky in the last few years through sort of living tiny to spend some time over there. So I would say that the best thing about, the improvement has been the flexibility. And then, having moved to the eco village, it's not necessarily, again, it's not about the house anymore, but it's enabled me to have a garden, which I'm loving, spend more time outdoors and sort of live, living in a community in a way that I would not have done, again, if I was living in a normal house. It's, the path it has sent me down, I think, is the advantage. And again, it's not necessarily the house itself. So it's the flexibility is the big advantage.
Now there's another question I'd just like to put to the group from, it was from Sue. Sue B, please, can you ask about the multiple occupancy communities, and if there's a word in here. Does anybody know what Kahalites. I think that's no, there's a spelling problem with that. Villages. She's talking about villages, and that relates to another question that someone was talking about multiple occupancy dwellings. Here we go. And that's the same person. So is there work going on about the multiple occupancy and tiny houses issue? Thanks. Now, I'm Chris, sorry to go back to you, but that was a question that somebody also put about, is your house, because it's a because it's like a cooperative, is it legal?
So the situation with the village is, regardless of the eco village, which is a wider thing, it's a cooperative where we own the wider part of land, but the plot I'm on is just like everybody else, in New South Wales. It's a plot of land with a house on it, and because I co-own the land under the regulation, therefore I can live in what is comes under the land as the regulation is a caravan permanently. So I'm no different to anybody on another plot of land, but the land ownership is key, and the fact that there is another house on the land as well.
Elle, just like Janine, just Elle, while we've got you back here, can you just, we'll see if it works. Can you just tell people how you got, oh no, we've lost Elle. So Elle is in a very special situation because she has had her block, she's on land and it is legally there in St. Kilda, but she did mention that before. Janine, you wanted to answer this?
So in regards to multiple tiny houses on a single lot, with Chris and her situation, obviously the eco village, depends on the actual zoning of the land within whichever state you're in. So depending on your zoning, you may have a zoning where you've got an opportunity to have what we call special planning, where it's deemed as a caravan park. And what we're trying to do through ATHA is also, where it's deemed as a caravan park, maybe there's an opportunity to also create a tiny house community. So all these things take, as you can imagine, take a long time to realise, because they're all regulatory changes, and that's what we're focusing on, is different pathways. Now, within some cases...
Sorry, Janine, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up there because we've come to the end of our time. So to everyone who's out there, if you want to find out more from all of these people, go on to the chat. The link to the ATHA website is on the chat. Chris put something in about the TED Talk from Zach Giffen. And thank you so much, everyone, for being on this talk. It's been fantastic.